A grey sky loomed over the Tower of London, casting a pale light on its ancient stones. It was May 19th, a date that would be remembered for centuries. In the inner courtyard of the fortress, something ominous had taken shape during the night. A scaffold, crafted from pale, clean wood, had been erected. Not the usual high platform designed for public spectacle, but a low, deliberate structure, close to the ground. Not for a common criminal. This one was built for a queen. Yet it was no ordinary execution. The instrument of death was not the English axe, with its brutal force and clumsy edge, but a sharp French sword, elegant, precise, foreign, and the man who would wield it had been summoned from across the channel, specially selected for his skill. The message was clear. This was to be swift, dignified, and silent. But no amount of refinement could mask what was about to take place. Whispers spread among the guards and early spectators. Today a queen will be executed, the first in England's history. The words hung in the air like fog. Inside the stone walls, in a small chamber that had become her prison for the past 17 days, Anne Boleyn awakened to her final morning. 35 years old, once the most powerful woman in England, now a condemned traitor. Outside, the city stirred. The air was heavy with tension. At court, no official mourning was declared. No bells tolled, no banners hung at half-mast. For many, it was as if she had already ceased to exist. But for Anne, for history, this day had only just begun. The chamber where Anne Boleyn had spent her final 17 days was small and dimly lit. It had once been used to house noble prisoners, but nothing about it felt noble now. The cold stone walls bore silent witness to her final hours. It was here, just after dawn, that Anne awoke on May 19, 1536, to the knowledge that she would not see another sunrise. Her composure, even then, remained intact. At 35, she still carried the grace and elegance that had once captivated King Henry VIII. Though imprisoned, stripped of titles and crown, she prepared herself with a dignity that seemed untouched by the accusations hurled against her. Her ladies-in-waiting, the few who had remained loyal, assisted her in dressing. Anne had chosen her garments with care. A dark gray mantle lined with fur, and beneath it, a bodice of deep crimson. These were not random choices: gray for mourning, crimson, a color that would not show blood. It was practical, yes, but more than that, it was a final act of quiet defiance. Anne would go to her death as a queen, calm, poised, and untrembling. "I hear the executioner is very good," she said softly, almost playfully, her fingers brushing her slender neck. "I have a little neck." The room fell silent at her words. It was a dark joke, yes, but also an act of astonishing courage. A moment where irony met tragedy, and fear was cloaked in wit. There is something deeply human in such a remark. It was not the words of a woman broken, but of one who saw clearly what awaited her and refused to cower. Witnesses recorded her bearing that morning, not with pity, but with awe. She prayed. She whispered to God. She smiled even. And in the silence between prayers, perhaps she remembered, her daughter still so small, her ambitions, her sacrifices, her triumphs turned to dust. But she would not beg, she would not protest. There would be no screams or desperate pleas. Anne Boleyn, who had once shaken the thrones of Europe with her ambition and fire, now faced her end with a grace that seemed to transcend even the scaffold itself. And outside, the crowd was gathering. Before she was a queen, before she became the most controversial woman in England, Anne Boleyn was a daughter, born into a world of diplomacy, ambition, and complex social games. She was not born to be ordinary. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was an ambitious courtier and diplomat, a man who moved easily among kings and emperors. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, came from one of the most ancient noble families in England. Anne's blood carried both hunger and heritage. She was likely born in 1501, though even her birth year remains debated. Such is the uncertainty that still clouds her story. What is known is that Anne spent some of her most formative years not in England, but in the royal courts of the Netherlands and France. There, she was educated in the households of powerful women, Margaret of Austria, and later Queen Claude of France. Unlike the daughters of English nobility, who were raised to be quiet ornaments, Anne was immersed in the Renaissance. In France, she absorbed art, music, philosophy, and literature. She learned fluent French, studied scripture, poetry, fashion, and statecraft. More than anything, she observed how power operated from behind a veil of civility. She watched queens maneuver through court intrigue and learned that intellect, charm, and subtlety could be as potent as armies. Anne was not considered conventionally beautiful. Her olive skin, dark hair, and sharp features deviated from the English ideal of pale, golden-haired innocence. But she had something more rare: presence, a magnetic energy, eyes that saw everything, a voice that could command silence. It began, as many tragedies do, with desire. When King Henry VIII turned his gaze toward Anne Boleyn in the mid-1520s, she was serving as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Unlike the many women who had caught the king's fleeting interest, Anne did not melt under his attention. Her sister, Mary Boleyn, had already been one of Henry's mistresses, used, cast aside, forgotten. Anne had seen that path, and she refused it. "I will not be your mistress," she is said to have declared. "If you want my heart and body, you must give me a crown." It was a dangerous demand. No woman had ever dared speak to a king in such terms. But Anne knew her worth, and more importantly, she knew his weakness. Henry, frustrated by Queen Catherine's inability to provide a male heir, saw in Anne not just passion, but a solution. She became an obsession. He wrote her letters filled with longing, calling her "my mistress and my friend," and begged for her favor. For 7 years, from 1526 to 1533, Henry's desire for Anne twisted itself into something larger than romance. It became a crusade. Anne did not surrender easily. She withdrew when needed, flirted when useful, and challenged Henry's mind as much as his heart. Her refusal only intensified his need. It was a game, but also a revolution. Because in order to make Anne his queen, Henry would have to break the very foundation of England's religious structure. The Pope denied Henry's request for an annulment from Catherine. In response, Henry tore England from the Catholic Church, declaring himself supreme head of the new Church of England. It was the boldest act of defiance by a monarch against Rome in centuries, and it was done, above all, for Anne. This was no longer just a love affair. It was a national crisis. And Anne, once the daughter of a diplomat, now stood at the center of a storm that would reshape England forever. In her rise, one could already sense the seeds of her fall, because Anne Boleyn had demanded a crown, and Henry, King of England and servant to his own desire, would give it to her. But crowns, as history shows, come weighted with a price. In January 1533, after years of courtship marked by politics, prayer, and peril, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn were secretly married. She was already pregnant, and time pressed upon them like a storm. Just months later, Henry would proclaim their union publicly, defying the Pope's authority and igniting a religious revolution. This marriage was not simply a scandal, it was a seismic rupture, the fracture of England's centuries-old alignment with the Catholic Church. In marrying Anne, Henry severed ties with Rome, established the Church of England, and crowned himself its supreme head. What had begun as desire had now rewritten the structure of faith itself. Anne, now Queen of England, finally held the crown she had once demanded, but it sat uneasily. Her coronation was grand, yet many in the court and the country despised her. To Catherine's supporters, she was a usurper. To Catholics, a heretic. To many women, a warning. Still, Anne believed in her mission. She threw herself into her new role with fierce conviction. She surrounded herself with reformers, encouraged the translation of the Bible into English, and supported scholars and clergy who challenged the old order. Her reign, brief though it would be, was not passive. She wielded her influence deliberately, reshaping the court intellectually and spiritually. But all of it hinged on one thing: a male heir. In September 1533, Anne gave birth to a child, a girl. Not the long-awaited son Henry so desperately wanted, but a daughter, Elizabeth. The disappointment was palpable. Henry, though reportedly affectionate at first, was visibly shaken. The pressure on Anne intensified. A queen who could not deliver a son was a queen on borrowed time. Still, Anne tried to remain hopeful. She believed she would bear again, and soon. But the birth of Elizabeth, though seen as a failure then, would become her greatest legacy. Ironically, history would remember this child far more than her father ever could. But in 1533, in the immediate aftermath, Elizabeth's birth marked the beginning of Anne's decline. The high tide of her power had come, and even as she smiled for portraits and paraded through London in royal robes, the crown already began to tremble on her head. For Anne Boleyn, the crown had always been a gamble, and now the odds began to shift against her. At first, she remained confident. She had become queen against all expectations, and she believed she could give Henry the heir he longed for. But fate was not kind. After Elizabeth's birth, Anne became pregnant again in 1534, only to suffer a miscarriage. It was a quiet tragedy, but one that shook the king's faith. Still, she remained in favor, just barely. Then, in 1535, another pregnancy. This time, the stakes were impossibly high. Everyone hoped for a boy. But again, Anne miscarried, this time with a male fetus. The blow was devastating. For Henry VIII, obsessed with legacy and desperate for a male heir, these failures were more than personal sorrow. They were political disasters. Kings were not meant to mourn. They were meant to build dynasties. Anne, once his symbol of hope, now became a reminder of his own frustration. And Anne was not an easy queen. She had strong opinions. She quarreled with Henry, challenged his advisors, and made enemies with her sharp tongue. Her reformist zeal and influence over the king had once dazzled, but now it irritated. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister and once her ally, began to turn against her. He saw that the king's passion was fading, that Henry, now drawn to Jane Seymour, another lady-in-waiting, was preparing for change. Cromwell moved quickly. In the cutthroat world of Tudor politics, survival depended on being one step ahead. Anne sensed the shift. She became more emotional, more anxious. Her once unshakable confidence began to show cracks. Her enemies whispered in corners, "She is finished." At court, smiles turned to silence. Allies drifted away. Even Henry, who had once risked his soul to possess her, grew cold. He stopped visiting her chambers. He no longer defended her in council. And Anne, who had ascended like fire, began to fall, like ash. On May 2nd, 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested. The Queen of England, once Henry's obsession, once the center of power, was now treated as a criminal. She was taken to the Tower of London, the very fortress where she had once celebrated her coronation. Now, its cold stones and iron gates would mark the beginning of her end. The charges were shocking: adultery, incest, treason, all grave crimes, but even more absurd in their construction. She was accused of having affairs with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn, and worse, of plotting the death of the king himself. The allegations were riddled with inconsistencies and outright impossibilities. Dates didn't align, meetings never happened, but truth no longer mattered. Behind it all was Thomas Cromwell. Once Anne's political ally, he had turned against her with chilling precision. It was a masterclass in Tudor betrayal, calculated, ruthless, and executed with legal flair. Cromwell understood what the king wanted before Henry ever spoke it. Anne had become inconvenient, and inconvenient queens did not survive long. Her trial, held on May 15th, was a spectacle of injustice. Anne was given no legal counsel, no right to confront her accusers, and faced a tribunal stacked with her enemies. The outcome was decided before a word was spoken. Yet, Anne stood her ground. Eyewitnesses recorded her eloquence, her poise, her astonishing courage. One wrote that she spoke, not like a woman, but like an angel. She denied the charges with clarity and calm, knowing full well her words would not save her. The sentence, guilty. The punishment, death by burning, the traditional penalty for female traitors. But even in cruelty, politics calculated. Henry commuted the sentence to beheading and arranged for a French swordsman, famed for his skill, to ensure a swift execution. Was this mercy, or merely a performance for foreign eyes? Anne returned to her cell, condemned but unbroken. She prayed, she waited, and she prepared to face death with the same fierce dignity with which she had once demanded a crown. May 19th, 1536. The morning Anne Boleyn was to die dawned gray and heavy, as if the sky itself mourned in silence. At 8 a.m., Anne was informed her execution had been postponed until noon. A small cruelty, perhaps unintentional, but devastating nonetheless. She had readied her soul for the end. Now she would wait, hours more, to feel the weight of what was coming. She spent the time in prayer, receiving communion, whispering supplications. Witnesses said she paused often during her prayers to repeat, "Lord, have mercy on me." And then, solemnly, she swore upon the consecrated host, "I am clear of all for which I am condemned." Around noon, the drums began. Anne gave her final gifts to her ladies-in-waiting: a prayer book, a piece of jewelry, a simple handkerchief, tokens of memory. "Remember me and how I end?" she asked them softly. The crowd gathered was smaller than expected, around 1,000 souls. But the atmosphere was unlike other executions. There was no jeering, no celebration, only silence, hats removed, eyes fixed on the scaffold. Anne appeared, dressed in gray and crimson, walking with the poise that had once stunned Europe. She was granted the chance to speak. Her words, carefully chosen, were a final act of grace and political brilliance. "Good Christians, I come here to die, according to the law. I accuse no man. I pray God save the king. For to me, he was always a good and sovereign Lord." She did not plead innocence, nor condemn her enemies. It was the ultimate performance of loyalty, protecting the Tudor crown, and, more importantly, her daughter Elizabeth. Anne removed her mantle, handed it to her lady, and gave the executioner a purse of gold coins. a final, haunting act of gratitude. There was no block. The sword required her to kneel upright. One of her ladies tied a blindfold. She whispered, "Jesus, receive my soul. O Lord God, have pity on my soul." The French executioner, in a moment of grim mercy, called out, "Where is my sword?" though the blade was already in his hand. Anne turned slightly toward the sound, and in that moment, the sword struck. One clean motion. No scream, no struggle. The queen's head fell from her shoulders. Silence swept the crowd, followed by a sigh, a sound of something beyond horror, sorrow. The executioner raised the head by the hair and proclaimed, "So perish the king's enemies." But no cheers followed, only a quiet murmur. The people had seen nothing. After the blade fell, there was no solemn procession, no royal mourning. Anne Boleyn, once crowned Queen of England, was given no coffin, no state funeral, no final rites worthy of her rank. Her ladies, still trembling from the horror they had just witnessed, gathered her remains. But there was no proper burial prepared. The guards, improvising, found an old arrow chest. Into it, they placed her slender body, and beside it, her severed head. Quietly, they carried it to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the Tower of London's walls. There, without tombstone, without prayer, she was buried anonymously beneath the stone floor, as if she had never existed. No name, no marker, just earth and silence. But the silence was political. Henry VIII ordered all portraits of Anne destroyed, her emblems removed, her name erased from official documents. A full damnatio memoriae, the ancient Roman practice of condemning memory. To the world, Anne Boleyn would be unremembered. And yet, Henry failed, because on September 7th, 1533, Anne had given birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. 23 years after Anne's execution, Elizabeth Thurse ascended the throne. She ruled England for 45 years, guiding it into a golden age of literature, naval power, and religious balance. And though she rarely spoke of her mother, Elizabeth made quiet gestures that spoke volumes. She adopted Anne's emblem, the white falcon, and surrounded herself with Boleyn relatives and loyalists. She never married. "I am married to England," she declared. Through Elizabeth, Anne triumphed. The daughter whom Henry had dismissed as a disappointment became one of the greatest monarchs in English history, and the mother, once executed in disgrace, was resurrected through legacy. In 1876, during renovations at the Tower Chapel, bones were found beneath the altar, delicate, feminine, with a small skull. Experts believe they belonged to Anne. Her remains were finally reburied with dignity. Today, the site of her execution is marked by a simple glass memorial, and every year, on May 19th, roses are laid in silence, not just in mourning, but in recognition. To many, Anne Boleyn is no longer just a tragic queen. She is a symbol of injustice, of intelligence punished, of feminine power feared. And in the end, the final irony remains. The woman they tried to erase became immortal through the daughter they never wanted.